Hamilton's report on public credit and the dinner, as it's called, or sometimes also called the Compromise of 1790. In September 1789, Washington is one of the bills that he's signing. He's getting, of course, his allies in Congress to shepherd it through the House and Senate. One of the first priorities is to create the Treasury Department. And, you have the branches of the government, but you also have within the executive branch, the cabinet. And to no one's surprise, within about a week after that, Hamilton is nominated to serve as the first Secretary of the Treasury. That's why he's on the $10 bill to this day. And then you flip the back, and of course, it has the United States Treasury Department. He would have probably been amazed and maybe proud of the fact that it's grown to such a significant institution, one of the most important elements of the executive branch. It is Hamilton at the time, he's 34, so relatively young in 1789, and he's ready to take on the challenge of trying to organize the finances of the United States. And the beginning of this report is what Congress asks Hamilton to do. They demand of the Secretary of Treasury and the Executive Department, Washington, look, we want you to report on the general finances of the United States. So Hamilton has to get an accounting for all of that, and that's his responsibility. It takes him 110 days. So within about 4 months, he's got his initial report, and with that report comes a list of recommendations that he's going to submit to the Congress for their approval, all of which are controversial, all of which, according to Hamilton, are absolutely necessary. So the new government for him is something of a tabula rasa. I mean, it's the potential out there to make the United States into a European-style state as far as an activist executive branch and his department, which many people think, the War Department is important. There's only a few executive offices. The State Department, obviously, and that's headed by Thomas Jefferson, but it's Hamilton who quickly and has no problem delving in the War Department and also in the State Department while he's also running the Treasury Department. It's Hamilton who thinks we can really aggressively make this one of the most important parts of the new government. And so what do you do when you gather all this information? You spend 100 or so days on it. Well, he comes to the conclusion, and I'm going to be using some slides today, as I usually do. So let's take a look-see here. Okay, there he is, Hamilton. And probably pretty accurate depiction of him when he's in his 30s. So here's a financial report. We'll get to what he actually calls it later on, but first we're going to take a look at the debt. This is the debt of the United States in 1789, or really it's 1790s when the report on public credit actually comes out. The debt total is $77 million. And it's a lot. It's a staggering amount of money in 1790. And when you get an assessment of it, Hamilton and others are like, okay, it's not the end of the world. We have a significant amount of debt. The next challenge in question is what priority should paying the debt be? And should you even try to pay off the national debt? There's a quote often associated with Hamilton. It says, not necessarily a curse, but a national debt may be a blessing. Well, it makes people think that Hamilton was okay with having a large debt. What he was essentially saying is nations have functioned with a substantial debt. You don't want the debt to get out of control, and you also want to make sure that you actively try to pay down the debt and pay the interest on the debt. So basically it's divided this way, and there's certain kinds of debt. There's debt owed by foreigners, nations, and individuals to the tune of about 12 million. But the largest area is the foreign, federal, domestic debt, the debt of the United States as a nation. And then you combine that with, of course, the state debt. Those are the two most significant numbers. The problem for the United States, the challenge, which we've outlined before when we said, here's a snapshot of the United States in 1790, is the nation is overwhelmingly agricultural. 95% of people work in that area. There are only a few banks. There is no uniform currency. There's no, currency of the United States. There's just, state notes, and the exchange rates are different depending on where you go. The government also has very little ability at this point to collect revenue. You're going to see at the bottom of this chart the methods by which the government can collect money. There's miscellaneous revenue, which is not a lot. Hamilton's going to propose a tax on distilled spirits. That's the middle area. That's the excise revenue. And so that's raised within the United States, items that are manufactured in the country. And maybe the largest, and I don't know why they don't have land sales, but that's probably in miscellaneous, but are customs duties. So the amount of money that's collected, you can see it left to right, with the right side of that chart showing that tariffs, or the impost as it was called, and Congress passed an impost in its first session. It was one of the most important things it did because it never could do it under the Confederation government of the earlier 1780s. So the debt, let's go back to the notes. The debt is mostly because of the American Revolution. That's where we had put together a lot of that money that we owe. And there's different types of debt. Now, this is economics. It literally bores me to tears, but it's significant for us to know. So I'll break it down as simply as possible because I fully do not understand it. Economic historians kind of love this stuff and they think it's fantastic. But I will just say that there's different types of debt from different situations and who you owe the money to. One is unpaid securities. And these are often called certificates. And the best way to describe them is to say they're something like paper IOUs. And they're scribbled out to pay folks for goods. And so we owe a lot of money to people within the United States because we gave them, if we didn't have paper money, we gave them a paper certificate. Literally, it's an IOU. And those folks wouldn't be happy, but Washington would tell his army during the Revolution, when you go commandeer stuff, take it and pay them, just be polite about it. The folks aren't going to be happy, but it's for the cause. There would also be soldiers that would be paid in a wide range of IOUs. Some states just paid them land and said, hey, if you live and don't die in the war, we'll give you land. And, you got land out west because we had nothing else to offer you. Those were often and called certificates as well. So literally different varieties of IOUs, which would essentially be how the debt was accumulated. Then there were securities. And securities are IOUs given by the government when it would redeem paper currency. So you can turn in paper currency for, I guess it's more like a bond. It's kind of a promise to, at one point, when a government could pay, they would pay. If they couldn't pay, they gave you an IOU. But the IOU is literally saying, at some point, this certificate, this security, will be good for something. And it'll also be good for once it's finally able to be collected by the individual who has the certificate, you'll get 6% interest on that security. Okay. By whatever name the government promises to pay back, and IOUs will be redeemable at face value in the future. So if it says $100, $25, you're supposed to get that much for it. The problem is with the debt that in 1786, we don't have any state government that was paying to the federal government under the Articles of Confederation. Remember, the Confederation Congress asked the states requisitions for money, and the states sometimes said no. They were busy paying their own debt. Some places like Massachusetts, which were putting taxes in place, poll tax and land taxes, to not pay off the national debt or their Massachusetts responsibility for the national debt, but the actual Massachusetts state debt. That's where they were raising taxes within the state. And when they did that, look what happened. We get Shays' Rebellion. in 1786 and 1787. Another challenge having to do with the debt, and this is all realized by Hamilton. He knows all of this is happening. In the debt issue is that there is a lot of debt, what we might call speculation. People are buying up certificates and making profits on them, and it's a little like finding buried gold. Let me explain how that works. Most certificates, okay, those IOUs, could be purchased. Now, so if you had one and it's worth $100, but it ain't worth anything because there's no government who would pay you $100 for it, you could sell it. Or from the buyer point of view, a speculator, in other words, could purchase it for 20% of face value with that 6% interest. So let's break it down how this works. Again, simple math for the sake of Dr. McDonald. If you pay 20% on a $100 certificate at 6% interest, or if you get a 30% annual return on the 20% that you would spend. Okay, let's break that down a different way. You would pay $20 for a $100 note. 20% of the value. That was the average he found out. So how would you get that 20%? Well, you might get $20 in paper currency. You might get $20 in hard currency, meaning gold. So it says 100, you sell it for 20, and that speculator now has a worthless piece of paper, but you have 20 quick bucks. That's actually money that you can use. The certificate isn't any good. So if the certificates were redeemed at face value, you can get an additional, if they were paying them at face value, 500% interest. And that's why people were buying them. But they were buying them with the promise that they would actually be worth the value, the amount printed on them. So as far as a lot of people were concerned, and a lot of these certificates were sold or actually given to Revolutionary War veterans. And they sold them to speculators who said, look, I'll give you quick cash, $10 if it's a $100 note, $20 if it's a $100 note. And this person says, yeah, I get the money very quickly. And you're done though. Once you sell that to a speculator, you have lost that certificate. So for Hamilton, all this boils down to is that if you honor the debt, it establishes the government. The government is now worthy of public confidence, and that kind of thing appeals to President Washington. And it would also end the confusing drift that we see under the Articles of Confederation, where we don't have a stable financial policy, where the national government asks for requisitions from the states, and the states often thumb their noses because they say, yes, we're putting tax policy in place, not to pay off the national debt or give you any money, Congress, but to pay off our own state debt. So it gets back to the idea of, all right, if you do honor these certificates, it is going to allow people to have faith and confidence in the government. And that means something for a lot of people, even though they might not fully understand how this whole interest rate or how much you're getting back and how much, if you finally have that worthless $100 certificate plus interest, what's it going to amount to? I mean, Hamilton is now saying we have to fund those certificates. Congress faces several key choices, though, when it comes to this issue that we're outlining. They can issue new paper money, which they would devalue, or they could maybe say, all right, we'll, at some point, if we can, honor the certificates with hard currency. Well, that's not really feasible because they don't have enough cash flow in the United States. They might also say, let's pass legislation that reduces the interest on those certificates, on those IOUs, in other words, or let the states figure it all out. Not have a central policy from Congress, or just wipe out all of those certificates. It's the idea of repudiating all of them. In other words, none of the certificates or IOUs are worth anything anymore. They're issued during the 1780s. They were matters, of course, that were having to do with the war, and we just don't have the money to pay them, and neither do the states. That really was not a good policy. And there were also moral issues as well involved in all of this. A lot of the debt was originally held by soldiers and farmers. These are the folks who contributed very much to the cause of the American Revolution. A lot of those soldiers had sold these certificates to speculators, and all of those who hold the certificates, they have a claim to this repayment. But as I said before, many of them had sold them to speculators long before. I mean, 1784, 85. I mean, they said, look, under the articles, I'm never going to see the money that's on this certificate. It's worthless. It's hopeless. I don't have faith in the current government. I've got this guy who comes along and offers me, I mean, the average was 20%, but what if you get offered, $50 on a $100 promissory note? You might just take it because you're never going to see the 100, but here you are with someone offering you 50. There's that, of course. Many of these certificates have changed hands multiple times. So the second owners, these are the people who are going to get the money, those that are currently owning these certificates. It doesn't seem right, of course. You've got a bunch of people who are gamblers, and then they're profiteers, and they know how the system works, and they've now taken the money out of the hardworking individual who was given a promissory note for their supplies so that the army could eat, and the soldier who couldn't get paid and got paid in a worthless certificate. Why aren't they getting the money? So that's the other moral issue. The Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton, is mindful of all of this. He's thinking about it, of course, and he knows that taxes on items coming in other words, a tariff, and the excise revenue on whiskey could bring in some of the money, but there's going to have to be more. And he asked Madison about it. Again, they're allies going back, of course, to Congress and the Constitutional Convention. Their kind of common goal of giving the national government stronger power. So consulting Madison, who at the time is a member of Congress, of course, representing Virginia, and Madison's response is very clear. He says, look, we need to pay the debt off completely. That's what it comes down to. If you want full faith and credit and you want people to take the nation seriously, you should pay completely off the national debt. And so Hamilton takes these considerations and then eventually drafts what we've referenced a couple of times. Let me show it to you here. I think we passed over it in the slideshow. This is what it would look like. This is Hamilton's 1790 report on public credit. And you can see, I'll read it, the report of the Secretary of the Treasury to the House of Representatives relative to a provision for the support of the public credit of the United States, going on and on. But for short, it's called the Report on Public Credit. It surprises a lot of people. In fact, it more accurately say it jolts the New York financial community, because that's where the capital of the United States exists still in 1790. So what does the report say? There's recommendations and there's assessments here. So he's taking in all of the numbers. That's why it took him a number of months working tirelessly on this report. He says we should repay all of the federal debt with hard currency over a long period of time. We should also pay it with Western land sales. So there'll be 4% interest paid back on the national debt. The other recommendation is that you will assume all of the state debts into the federal debt. So that, what would we say, $22 million would then be rolled into the national debt. So that's where we get the idea of assumption, where you assume all the state debts into one federal debt. This would, among other things, make the federal government important. Hamilton was quite clear on federal power versus state power. Federal power is that. I mean, we've established not necessarily that we've shared, but that in some things, the federal government does and handles everything, literally. That's his idea. It would also, of course, make the moneyed class in the country, which is about 5% of the population, love the federal government, which is not lost on Alexander Hamilton. It would also pay off all of their investments. It would pay the national debt at a pretty slow rate. It might take decades as far as he is concerned, but Hamilton, once again, thinks that is okay. So what we're talking about here is funding all of these certificates. And we'll get into the details of how that works, and the assumption. These are two of three major parts in the report on public credit. Congress begins to debate Hamilton's 1790 report, and Madison knows that a change is now happening with the announcement of Hamilton's plan. The mood had not been the same as it was in 1789. He's beginning to see what will become a large break between himself, Madison, and the Washington administration. Up to that point, up to Hamilton's financial plan, we could accurately say that they had worked closely with the president to pass legislation. Things like the impost, setting up the Judiciary Act and the court system in the United States, and of course, the Bill of Rights. Now, it is Madison who is in opposition to two of the three parts of the financial plan. And his role as shepherding through, kind of like the prime minister, kind of like the man who's going to take all of the ideas that Washington has, putting the different elements of the executive branch through Congress, getting them improved. Madison may not be that person anymore. So his role as shepherding these initiatives through Congress ends. He supports the debt repayment. So it is Madison who supports the funding idea. We are funding these at face value. But he wants, Madison, to find the initial security holders and give them 50% face value. And Hamilton says, no, we cannot, absolutely cannot do that. Hamilton asks the really legitimate question: how on earth do we find these folks? That soldier, that farmer who was paid at the time a worthless certificate or IOU is entitled to, Madison says, half of that money. And Hamilton thinks making these claims legitimate and believing these people who are going to come out of the woodwork is going to be next to impossible. Madison worries, and I think rightly so, that a lot of the repayment at face value with interest is going to go to speculators. And it is, at the end of the day, unfair. To which Hamilton would answer, well, look, everybody got what they wanted when they sold their certificates. That soldier got a quick amount of cash, maybe even specie or hard currency, so he could go back to his farm after he's been dismissed or discharged from the army. The speculator was taking the risk. They are buying essentially a worthless piece of paper. And so with that risk comes a reward, as Hamilton was, of course, arguing. That's going to make those folks who are the speculators very grateful and beholden to the national government. And that also worried Madison as well. In the midst of these deliberations, we have a topic that's already been discussed, and that is the Quaker petitions come in that denounce the importation of slaves and call for a ban, Congress banning the international slave trade. Southerners had quoted in this argument several sources to back up the legitimacy of slavery, including Jefferson's recently written Notes on the State of Virginia. That was a little bit awkward for Thomas Jefferson as he comes back from France to assume his duties as Secretary of State. But the matter, as we know from the story in previous discussions, was killed in committee. The committee reported out of it that, look, Congress clearly cannot regulate the slave trade until 1808. So the reason I mention this again, and Washington was very glad that the whole episode ended. He said the ill-judged bit of business finally comes to an end. The reason I kind of interject that about the anti-slavery petitions is that it reminds us about the ideas of what the government can and cannot do. And it was very clear to members of Congress, North and South, even Northerners who don't want to bring up the issue of slavery. They say, look, it's very clear in the Constitution that we are limited from doing anything about the slave trade until 1808. So this is all many moving parts happening. At the same time, we're working on a treaty, attempted treaty with the Creek Confederacy in the American Southwest. There's also efforts to deploy an American army into the Northwest Territory, something we're going to talk about in the future. So getting back to the whole financial plan for Hamilton as proposed, and then needing Madison to make sure it goes through. The greatest problem for Madison is the assumption of the state debts by the federal government. This goes back to the idea of fairness, or as far as Madison was concerned, not fair at all. Some states have been very good at paying down their state debt, like, Virginia, his home state, Connecticut and Massachusetts were drowned in unpaid debt, as was New York. Virginia was not. So he asks Madison and others in Congress the very, very practical question. Why should other states like Virginia that had sound financial policies pay down their state debt? Why should they now have to help pay down the debt of other states? And that's a really good question. Enough congressmen agreed that on April 12th, the assumption plan was defeated initially in Congress. Hamilton is crushed. This is, to him, one of the most important elements of the report on public credit. What he really needs now is an issue that would break the logjam of a lot of what he thought was self-interested voting. They can't see the big picture. These local congressmen, these are the ones who are voting down assumption. And Madison knew he had the votes, so he can stand up and say, I oppose this and I'm not alone. So you need another issue, maybe, that you can, wheel and deal on. And the other issue in front of Congress in 1790 and 1791 is the issue of what they call residency. And that term is there in the notes. Residency literally means the struggle over the national capital and where they're going to put it in the future. It becomes pretty much a geographic free-for-all. And there are different alliances within the Congress that back different locations. And like any other project that Congress is arguing over, whether it be 1790 or 2021, where things happen, the amount of money spent can benefit your region, can benefit you as a congressman or senator, of course. And the town or the city that wins this all-important sweepstakes for the new capital of the United States would very much benefit financially. Investments would go into this individual town or city. Again, it wasn't clear. People thought it should be maybe an established city. It made sense. Others said, no, just maybe a small town that would grow. So the investment, the money that would pour in from the federal government, once this issue was solved and Congress voted on a residency law, you would employ workers. You'd have to build the buildings. You have to have the centers of government. They were using buildings that already existed in New York in 1790. You could also influence policy if you, New York or Philadelphia, was the city that hosted the Capitol. The consensus in 1790 among Congress is that the residence question, or where the residency of the federal city should exist, should be one that is centrally located. And maybe you could build a new city, or you could use the existing infrastructure. So that's unclear. Why start from scratch? Others said starting from scratch would possibly be a good thing. We could design a unique American city. But the already established cities were saying, no, 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 no. Why would you do that? I mean, where? In the middle of the woods and the frontier? Oh my gosh, it's just absolutely unthinkable. So New York was lobbying for it because that's where it existed. Philadelphia, there's a lot of nostalgic, of course, connections going back to 1776 and Congress meeting before the American Rebellion. The falls of the Delaware River, also in Pennsylvania. Trenton, a small town on the Delaware River in New Jersey. Baltimore, up and coming. That certainly was a town on the make. Germantown in Pennsylvania. They also had an undisclosed location, they weren't too specific about it, near Maryland and Virginia on the Potomac River. And that's where a lot of the interest among Southerners existed. Congress voted for Trenton in 1784. Good news. Bad news is they never voted to allocate the money. So you can't move the federal city if Congress doesn't authorize the money to do it. Philadelphia lost the battle to host the Capitol by a single vote in 1787. It's just almost comic at this point. And so 1787, the Constitutional Convention, the first Congress goes into session, and these battles start up all over again. Battle lines are drawn. There are alliances in Congress among Northern and Southerners. New York, then Philadelphia, then the Potomac River location. Madison favors the Southern location because, well, it's in Virginia. And, you know, if you owned the land there, the government might buy it from you, and it would really put Virginia on the map. There are probably other reasons as well about moving it to the south, reasons we'll get into in the future. So into all of this story, we introduced Thomas Jefferson. Recently returned from Europe and now fully ready to again become part of the government as the first Secretary of State. It is Jefferson who tells the story. He sees Hamilton, and this is after the vote on assumption, which kills initially the assumption bill. He is sulking outside of the president's house in Washington, D.C. I'm sorry, not yet, in New York. Sulking outside the president's house that hadn't been built yet in Washington. And Jefferson describes Hamilton as sober, which is good, but haggard and dejected. His dress was uncouth, very unusual for Alexander Hamilton. He was also describing him as disheveled. Again, you can take Jefferson's words for whatever you think. Nevertheless, he comes across him and probably inquires what's going on. Hamilton admits to Secretary of State Jefferson that, look, without assumption and the congressional gridlock, the whole financial plan is going to be killed. And the no vote on the assumption is he's just completely dejected by the whole thing. And he also says he might have to resign. And then if that happens, the government and the entire country are all liable to an eventual collapse. Now, will this happen? Probably not. But again, Hamilton's pretty upset, and he's dramatizing his role in the government and how important the assumption of state debt actually is. Jefferson says, look, one of my things I want to do when I get back, when I return from Europe, is to host a dinner party that originally I was going to have Congressman Madison over, and you might want to join us for this, and we can talk about this and other matters. Now, we know later on, so we've kind of put what happens later with Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton, this idea that they are bitter enemies in the cabinet battles and what become, of course, the political battles and the creation of political parties. But here, this is really an amiable invitation by Secretary of State Hamilton. He's asking Hamilton to attend the dinner between himself and Madison. Maybe we can discuss some of the options. Jefferson's account might be charming and self-serving, but it is the only one that we have. No one else leaves any information about this so-called meeting. Did he, and the evidence teases out the possibility, did Jefferson broker some type of far-reaching agreement, which later will be seen as almost important as the Missouri Compromise or the 1850 Compromise, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and 1821, which again limits slavery in the West, the 1850 Compromise, which people think kind of holds off a sectional battle between the North and South for at least 10 years. So we don't know what happened. We can only assume what happened. But Madison in the House lets a core provision of the assumption plan go through. So he ends his whole opposition to it, and maybe he brings some people who were opposed to it along to his point of view. And Hamilton will, in this aftermath of Madison ending his resistance, essentially say, well, look, I'll give you a hand with the whole residence question. And historians ever since then, for over 200 years, have fantasized about being this so-called proverbial fly on the wall when it comes to what we call the Compromise of 1790. I think I have an artist rendition of, these. This would probably be Hamilton and Jefferson here. Jefferson was known to be obviously a great entertainer. You had to be back then, spending money he didn't have. He lived very well in Europe. That helped get himself further into debt, probably brought back a lot of influence, not only of cooking, but the wine. He brought boxes and boxes of stuff back from Europe. And you can see there would have been a lavish multi-course meal between the three gentlemen. So we don't know what was said, what was done, but we only know the aftermath. And from there, we have to make our own assumptions. In July, after the vote was originally killed in April, a 32-29 vote passes the law to keep the capital in Philadelphia for a 10-year period from 1790 to 1800. And in that 10-year period, we will see the construction of the eventual future federal city on the Potomac River. So the residency question is solved. 2 weeks later, and again, Congress often moves slow, but the connections between the two votes make you ask the question, what was going on? 2 weeks later, a 34-28 vote passes the revised assumption bill. People at the time in Congress know of the deal. So it's worked out by these three gentlemen. And in the aftermath, we have the effects of this so-called deal, whether or not it was a deal or not, or there was just a conversation made. And Hamilton, I don't know, he probably thinks, look, I've got nothing to lose and everything to gain. If I give lip service to this idea of moving the federal city to the swamps of the Potomac, sure, no problem. Jefferson writes to James Monroe in Virginia, who at the time was serving as a United States senator, that, and Jefferson defends the deal, and not only for the immediacy of the deal, but for posterity. He tells Monroe, I had to agree to the deal or the Union itself would be threatened. So the nation was at stake. Again, maybe a little bit over the top. Or, Jefferson also says, there would be a much worse deal for the state of Virginia. I mean, we would have lost, possibly, the residency completely if we hadn't agreed. or we hadn't allowed Madison to go back to Congress and say, all right, if we fix this and that of the assumption bill, you and your allies will drop the opposition to it. 2 years later, Jefferson is now saying that the bargain he made with Hamilton is the worst political mistake of his life. And sometimes he tells people that Hamilton swindled us or he hoodwinked us on the deal. That's a little difficult to believe. It makes him seem less like a duped dunce and more like an effort to actually help the infant nation. And again, you can see it here with the scenario that Jefferson creates in his mind. The same way he can justify slavery in his own mind, he can justify his role in the so-called Compromise of 1790. So writing to Monroe, it's a way to say, look, we had to do this. There were no other choices. The nation was going to come apart. Okay, if that's what he believes in his own mind. But if he can say that strongly, if he can dramatize the fact that without this deal, the nation would come undone, it doesn't make him look like Hamilton got the better of him. And the deal, again, 10 years, moving the capital, where it was going to be built, it was going to be drawn up, they were going to have buying land, organizing the architectural plans, because I think Hamilton, in his heart of hearts, really thinks that after 10 years in Philadelphia, this is the deal in the residency question, that no one's going to want to move to the swamps of the Potomac. So yeah, of course I'll say, yeah, sure, let's move it down south, no problem here. And then it will never actually happen. But something else happens as far as these three gentlemen are concerned that we also have to begin to discuss, because it's going to relate directly to the formation of the political parties in the United States. The deal begins to shift Madison's political course. And maybe we see reservations about some of the things he believed in at the Philadelphia Convention. We also know that after 1790, Madison begins to double down more on his dedication to his home, Virginia, and to the region, the South. Maybe it was the anti-slavery petitions. Maybe, as a lot of folks to this day, now you've seen this in modern political races, there's always criticism of people who served in, again, we're talking about 2021, in Washington, D.C., that, oh, you don't go home enough, you haven't made contact with, your constituency, you spend too much time in Washington, D.C., and you're part of the problem, or whatever else people use as catchphrases to kind of represent a disconnect from the faraway government and the folks back home. Madison's practical fear in 1790 is that he's not going to get reelected to Congress. 1790 is what we would today call, they didn't use the term back then, a midterm election. It's the election in between the presidential contests. So he uses this agreement, his support of the residency question, to help justify and explain his position on a number of topics. And it clearly is important to the people in Virginia because he wins re-election. Because he can say, look, we're bringing to the Potomac and Virginia, shared with Maryland, the future federal city. He travels to Philadelphia with Jefferson because that's where the capital is going to be moved. So each can find lodgings in the new capital, and then both of them travel and return home to Virginia. Congress wasn't in session a lot. There wasn't a lot for the, when they weren't in session, for the government to do, and people didn't even contemplate staying in the capital, especially Jefferson, who had no love for cities, unless sometimes it was a foreign country, because he was enamored with Paris. On the trip south, it is Madison who stops in at Mount Vernon, because with Congress not in session, the government not meeting, Washington returns home as well. Madison doesn't stay, but we do know that the tie between, or the connection between Jefferson and Madison is growing stronger. The one between Madison and Washington is thinning, and we might say getting more and more strained after 1791. Hamilton then sends more shock waves through Congress. To pay for funding and assumption, you've got to bring in revenue. And there isn't a lot of revenue sources for the United States in 1791. There's going to be, he proposes, a new excise on distilled spirits, followed by the creation of a Bank of the United States, a new financial institution. So it is Hamilton who is putting in place what we can say accurately, the individual parts, the building blocks for a strong, active federal government and a powerful financial state. Public credit, the government backing public credit, paying off at face value the people who currently own the certificates, putting in place a revenue stream for money to come into the country, a customs service. I mean, if this sounds awfully English, Hamilton would say, yeah, because it works for them. I mean, the customs agents were the most hated people in the American colonies during the 1760s and 70s. A customs service, both foreign and for dealing with the tariff overseas. So you'd have excise officers. He was building the largest department in the executive branch, the Treasury Department. Who did Thomas Jefferson have working at the State Department? Him and like 2 clerks. That effectively was the State Department of the United States in 1791. Hamilton's department is a sprawling group of clerks, assistants, deputies, and those who are working behind the scenes to make sure that the excise gets collected for distilled spirits and also for the amount of money coming in with the tariff or the impost. And now on top of everything else, Hamilton was proposing a central bank. All of his programs would raise moral and legal issues, but maybe no more than the bank, or as we call it for short, the BUS, the Bank of the United States. Maybe more than any other. Obviously, there were issues about the whole question of should you find the original certificate holders? Was it legal for the national government to assume the debts of the states? But the BUS, the Bank of the U.S., according to Hamilton, then it's very clear. And without a doubt, the nation needs an institution that does a lot of things that we would, I think, remind us of the Federal Reserve, or the Fed, as we call it. You should be mindful of what the Fed is doing now, because you may want to borrow money. And when you borrow money at a bank or another financial institution, what the Federal Reserve does about the money supply and interest rates help again steer the economy. So what would the BUS, the Bank of the U.S., do? Or in this case, it would be the First Bank of the United States. Well, I mentioned a couple of those roles already. Expand the money supply. You would be able to extend credit to the government of the United States. So it's a strange kind of institution. It's legally put together by the government, and it's partly funded by the government. And then people, of course, would be able to buy interest in it as well. So extending credit to the government, the national government, and to different businesses, it would be able to collect the revenue of the United States, coming in with the excise tax on distilled spirits, and of course, the tariff. It would be able to make the debt payments of the United States. Hamilton wants to pay it off slowly, but he nevertheless wants to pay it off. And it would handle things like foreign exchange, about different currencies of different nations coming in. And by foreign exchange, that's important to all of us, because what's the dollar worth overseas against the euro, against the English pound, or other currencies around the world? And that's what the BUS would do. And as I said before, it makes and takes government deposits. So we'd pay off the debt. We'd also hopefully, spend more money than we took in. On January 20, 1791, the bank bill breezes through the Senate of the United States. The House begins debates that would begin to drive two sides apart over the bank issue. And we see the onset of what no one wanted in Congress and in the nation, but nevertheless did develop. And that is, of course, the beginning of political divisions and political parties, hardened political parties. It also creates, and this is important to our story, a deep chasm between Hamilton and Madison. They had briefly, of course, been restored, this amicability between the two gentlemen over the excise issue, which again, Madison wasn't thrilled with, but saw as absolutely necessary. The bank was a whole nother matter. There is a deep anti-bank bias in the United States in 1791. One congressman said, "I would rather be seen in the street with basically a prostitute than a banker." People needed banks. They may not like banks, but they were necessary as far as Hamilton was concerned. They would also play out in the debates about the bank sectional issues all over again. The bank was going to be located, to no one's surprise, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So the financial centers of the nation would be in the North. So there was this idea that folks in the South may not need banks as much as those in the North. So it would enrich the North and hurt the South. The other question that was obvious to Jefferson and Madison is over the constitutionality of the bank. Where in the Constitution, that's, the ink had barely dried on it at this point, could you actually create a bank? Hamilton picks out the Constitution and turns to Article 1, Section 8. And that is the section specifically dedicated to Congress. He says that under the so-called necessary and proper clause, which Madison at the time had endorsed. Basically, one of those wonderfully vague sentences inside the Constitution itself, necessary and proper. So that leaves a lot of wiggle room, and that is up for interpretation. The House votes 39-20 in support of the bank bill, though it is a regional vote, strongly supported by the northern states, New England and the Atlantic states, and opposed by the South. Madison thinks, all right, it's passed through the Senate, it sailed through the Senate. It got a pretty strong approval by the House, but no doubt Madison expects that Washington maybe in his fondest hope, will veto the actual bank bill and kill it.